Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we saw King Christian IV of Denmark win a glorious triumph over Sweden in the Kalmar War. The Danish armies captured both Kalmar and Elfsborg, and in the middle of all this chaos, the King of Sweden died, leaving the government in the hands of his young son, Gustavus Adolphus. Christian came close to realizing his ultimate goal of re-establishing the Kalmar Union, but in the end that final prize slipped between his fingers, partly because he failed to take Stockholm, and partly because the English and the Dutch didn't want Denmark to grow too powerful, so they put pressure on Christian to end the war without dealing Sweden a fatal blow. But that doesn't mean King Christian came out of the Kalmar War feeling disappointed. To him, it had been a success. Sweden had to pay a cool $1 million to get Elfsborg Castle back for a second time, and on a personal level, the king had managed to convince everyone, including himself, that he was a military genius. Today, he'll try to repeat the success from the Kalmar War, but on a much grander scale. Episode 85, The Emperor's War. The continental conflict I'm referring to is, of course, the war of religions that would tear Europe apart in the 17th century. A conflict between Protestants and Catholics had been simmering for longer than most people could remember, but no one knew that the decades-long tension and low-level conflict would soon explode in a firestorm that would rage throughout continental Europe for 30 years. The Reformation, which was almost a century old by this point, had led to political tensions in Europe as soon as Luther's ideas were embraced by people with political power. We've already talked about this in the Scandinavian context, and if you've managed to block it out but are willing to risk a reminder, you can go back and listen to episodes 73 to 76. The situation in the Holy Roman Empire was even more delicate, not only because this was the epicenter of the Reformation, but also because it was made up of a crazy number of small states where adherents of the old and new religious ideas clashed. In the 1550s, Protestants and Catholics agreed to put an end to the conflict by agreeing to the Peace of Augsburg. It was decided that whoever ruled the kingdom, principality, duchy, or other political entity within the Holy Roman Empire would also decide which form of Christianity would be practiced there. In Latin, the principle is called cuius regio, eius religio, or whose realm, his religion. And it divided the Holy Roman Empire into Lutheran and Catholic states, depending on the preference of their rulers. On paper, this was a neat solution, based on a principle with a fancy Latin name, which is always a bonus. But it had a few flaws. For example, what do you do when a ruler changes his religion? And what should you do when the ruler belongs to a tiny religious minority in his own realm? And what about Calvinists and other reformist Christians who weren't Lutherans? All these issues, built into the agreement from Augsburg, all but guaranteed that the conflict would flare up again at some later point. The peace accord was undermined in the second half of the 16th century as Protestantism spread throughout German states that had been officially designated as Catholic at Augsburg. It didn't help one bit that some of these new Protestants were Calvinists, not Lutherans. They had been excluded from the agreement altogether, and they were despised by Catholics and Lutherans alike. Another factor that weakened the position of the Peace of Augsburg was that the Holy Roman Emperor wasn't a big fan. As a Catholic, he wasn't particularly enthusiastic about the spreading of Protestantism, and the agreement also strengthened the autonomy of the various princes and other rulers throughout his empire, at the expense of the central authority, which hadn't been particularly strong to begin with. To add to the mix, there were also other tensions in Europe at the time that weren't related to religion, but which influenced how people chose to act once the conflict got going. For instance, the Holy Roman Empire was ruled by the Habsburgs, and so was Spain. These two empires squeezed France, the most populous and powerful kingdom on the continent, from two sides, creating a simmering rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Bourbon rulers of France, who were all good Catholics. Things started to heat up when the Imperial Diet met in February 1608. And just to be clear, the Imperial Diet was a meeting of representatives from the various states that made up the Holy Roman Empire. At this meeting, the Protestants wanted to see a reconfirmation of the agreement from Augsburg. The emperor's representative, Archduke Ferdinand, said that this would only happen on condition that all property that had been seized by Protestants after 1555 was returned to the church. The Protestants balked at the suggestion. They had seized so much church property in the last half-century that the economic ramifications would probably be unmanageable. But perhaps the real damage done by this demand wasn't that it gridlocked the discussion at the Diet. No, the biggest issue was that Archduke Ferdinand had dropped the pretense of imperial impartiality between Protestants and Catholics. Now it was clear to everyone that the emperor was firmly in the Catholic camp. This, in turn, led to a general trend among Protestants to repair and expand fortifications and to raise troops. That same year, Frederick IV, Elector Palatine, one of the most influential German princes, founded the Protestant Union. This led to the predictable countermove of setting up the Catholic League the following summer. These two organizations inserted a new level of militarization along sectarian lines that the Holy Roman Empire didn't really need. In this climate of heightened tension, the childless Emperor Matthias was getting old and frail. As you may or may not know, the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a hereditary monarchy. Instead, a handful of German princes, called the Electors, chose the new ruler when the old emperor died. But usually a close relative of the former emperor was elected. So now, as the emperor was getting older, men with dynastical ambitions started to position themselves to succeed him. One candidate was Emperor Matthias's cousin, Archduke Ferdinand, who had thrown a spanner in the works at the Imperial Diet in 1608. He was supported by the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family because he promised to aid them in their seemingly never-ending war against the stubborn Dutch, who refused to submit to the Spanish Empire. Frederick V, the Elector Palatine who had set up the Protestant Union, was also interested in the job. He was married to Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of King James of England. His chances were slim, though, because 4 of the 7 electors were Catholics, and they would never elect a Protestant emperor. But on the other hand, it was enough that one of the electors became a Protestant for the balance to shift in favor of the Protestants. One of those 7 voting electors was the King of Bohemia. And in May 1617, Archduke Ferdinand took on that job, giving him control over the Bohemian vote. This would seemingly strengthen his chances of succeeding his cousin, but Ferdinand was a staunch Catholic, and the largely Protestant Bohemian nobility feared that he would work against their interests and undermine their religious rights. Ferdinand tried to soothe their worries by reconfirming the religious freedoms that Protestants already enjoyed in Bohemia, but he soon proved that talk is cheap when a number of legal cases over property were all settled in favor of the Catholic Church. Against this backdrop, Protestant Bohemian nobles met with Ferdinand's representatives in May 1618. The meeting, which took place at Prague Castle, ended abruptly when the king's Catholic representatives were thrown out of the window. This incident is known as the Third Defenestration of Prague. Yes, third. Luckily, all 3 men survived. According to Catholic legend, a guardian angel caught them before they were crushed against the ground. Protestants, on the other hand, like to claim that they landed in a dung heap below the window. The defenestration in 1618 was the beginning of a more general uprising, which spread among the Protestant aristocracy, not only in Bohemia but also in large parts of Austria. The rebellious nobles established a renegade Protestant government in Prague. This threatened to destabilize the Habsburg hold over the whole empire. Ferdinand needed to reassert control over Bohemia, but the Austrian Habsburgs were strapped for cash and had to ask their Spanish relatives for financial aid. And if the Spanish got involved, that inevitably drew in the Dutch. A number of other countries, such as Savoy and the Ottoman Empire, also got involved, trying to weaken the Habsburgs by supporting the Bohemian rebels. Then, in March 1619, Emperor Matthias died. On August 19th, the Bohemian estates nullified the election of Ferdinand as King of Bohemia, and on the 26th, they offered the crown to Frederick, the Protestant Elector Palatine. 2 days later, Ferdinand was elected emperor, making the war inevitable if Frederick accepted the Bohemian crown. The Dutch urged him to do it. If the conflict in Germany would escalate, they hoped this would force the Spanish to move troops there, which in turn would let up the pressure on the Netherlands. So they offered subsidies to Frederick and the Protestant Union, helped raise loans for Bohemia, and provided weapons and munitions. Encouraged by the enthusiastic Dutch support, Frederick accepted the Bohemian crown and entered Prague in October 1619. But Ferdinand hadn't accepted this turn of events. He was preparing for war. And in that war, Frederick had few allies except the Dutch. Most of his other friends, including his Protestant father-in-law, James I of England, chose not to offer any active support in his conflict with Emperor Ferdinand. They were uneasy about the dodgy way he'd obtained the crown, and many also hoped that not getting involved would limit the war to a Bohemian affair, and the rest of the Holy Roman Empire might avoid getting sucked into the conflict. In July 1620, even the Protestant Union proclaimed its neutrality, but at the same time the Catholic League sided with Ferdinand. Their army, under the command of Count Tilly, crushed the rebellion in Austria and then turned its attention to Bohemia. The two sides met at the Battle of White Mountain in November 1620. Here, Count Tilly and his forces crushed the Bohemian army, and Frederick drew the conclusion that he needed to get out of Bohemia. Fast. But Ferdinand wasn't going to let him get away so easily. As a first step, he stripped Frederick of his right to be an elector. That privilege was transferred to Bavaria, and the emperor also agreed to let Maximilian of Bavaria annex parts of the Palatinate. This was too much for many German princes, though, especially Protestant ones, who had supported Ferdinand in the fight over the Bohemian crown. They saw Ferdinand's vindictiveness as a sign of imperial violation of the rights of a German prince, and they were worried that this would set a new precedent. In August 1620, Spanish troops occupied the rest of the Palatinate. In response, King James of England, who previously had cautioned his son-in-law Frederick against taking the Bohemian crown, also interfered. But Frederick's backers failed to coordinate their efforts, and the Catholic League and Spain won a series of victories against them in 1622. By November that year, the imperial forces controlled all of the Palatinate, except Frankenthal, a town some 70 kilometers south of Frankfurt am Main, which was held by a small English force. The English held the city for a few months, but in early spring 1623, King James ordered the English commander to hand the city over to the imperial army. Frederick was no longer an elector, and he had lost control over the Palatinate. The rest of his life was spent in exile in The Hague. Emperor Ferdinand had won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. His high-handed treatment of Frederick had not only created an international conflict, it had also deepened the divide between Catholics and Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire and banded the Protestants together against the emperor. King Christian IV of Denmark was following all these developments in the Holy Roman Empire with great interest. He saw the Protestant cause was under threat, and he felt that he, as a Protestant king, not to mention self-proclaimed military genius, from a wealthy kingdom, should be the champion of his German coreligionists. He was itching to get involved in the war. Beyond the lofty ideals of protecting Protestantism, Christian IV also had a couple of more practical objectives for an intervention. First of all, he aimed to obtain control over the great German rivers, the Elbe and the Weser. They were important trade routes in a time when road quality left a lot to be desired, and since Denmark already taxed all the trade in and out of the Baltic Sea, adding these rivers that flow into the North Sea west of Denmark would mean adding tax revenue from the trade that currently escaped Danish taxation. Secondly, he wanted to secure incomes and positions for his two younger sons, who otherwise wouldn't have any serious incomes after their older brother inherited the crown. Christian IV wanted to do this by making sure they were given control over German lands, and in a move that partially overlapped with his first aim, he went for the cities of Verden and Bremen, the last of which straddles the river Weser, thus achieving the goal of Danish control over the river at the same time. The King of Denmark exploited the growing fears among German Protestants, especially after the defeat at the Battle of White Mountain, to cajole them into agreeing to this arrangement already back in 1620. All in all, not a bad outcome. King Christian could have stopped there. In fact, the Council of the Realm urged him to do just that. But Christian wasn't satisfied with the increased tax revenues and the financial security for his two younger sons. He still craved more martial glory. But this time, the council held firm. They were not going to approve any Danish involvement in the war. But when the Council of the Realm refused to consent to funding a war, the Dutch and the French stepped in. As always, the Dutch were willing to chip in to make sure the war in Germany kept going, perhaps counterintuitively considering Christian was going to war to defend Protestantism. The very Catholic Kingdom of France promised to back him as well. Their interests were similar to the Dutch. They wanted to weaken the Habsburgs, and if that meant supporting what they considered to be Protestant heretics, then so be it. They promised to subsidize Christian's campaign, and if he couldn't declare war as King of Denmark, he would just have to exploit that old loophole and declare war as the Duke of Holstein instead. And so he did. In 1625, Christian declared war, not as King of Denmark, but as Duke of Holstein. This Danish involvement in the war that we know as the 30 Years' War is called the Emperor's War in Denmark. Also, the new King of England, Charles I, who had succeeded his father earlier that year, agreed to help. Charles promised to send almost 14,000 soldiers from Scotland, and in addition another 6,000 English soldiers. An army of 20,000 men was a big commitment, even though it would take a long time before they were all deployed. A little too long, in Christian's opinion. In addition to these English and Scottish troops, Christian also commanded some 20,000 mercenaries and his own army of about 15,000. He hoped that he'd also be able to count on support from the Protestant princes in the Holy Roman Empire, but their support would not be universal. Both Saxony and Brandenburg, for instance, two big and important German states, had objected to Danish involvement in the conflict, and they weren't interested in helping Christian out. That's perhaps not an optimal beginning when the people you claim to go to war for are asking you not to come. Anyway, with the promised assistance from the French, the Dutch and the English taken into account, Christian drew up his plans for the war. The plan was to advance deep into the Holy Roman Empire. He would lead the main force along the river Weser, and the English force, supported by troops from the various German principalities, would attack the Imperial Army headquarters in the city of Magdeburg. It was defended by Albrecht von Wallenstein, one of the most formidable commanders in the Imperial Army. Wallenstein was both a skillful military thinker and a cynical opportunist who had made a fortune crushing the rebellion in his native Bohemia by confiscating land and property belonging to defeated Protestant noblemen. He was tall and gangly, often brooding. The fact that he dressed in black and wore a striking burgundy red cape did exactly nothing to take away from his classic movie villain image. In late April, the English army was approaching Dessau. It was vital for Christian's plans that his troops take the town and its bridge in order to advance in Magdeburg. For the same reason, Wallenstein was eager to keep the Protestants from crossing. The imperial forces arrived first, and they proceeded to set up their artillery overlooking the river. When the English army arrived on April 25th, they were in good spirits. They thought they had a pretty good chance of making it across the bridge, since the Catholic force defending it was relatively small. Obviously, they didn't know anything about the artillery that was waiting for them. But they were soon made aware. As soon as they started to push across the bridge, in fact. To make matters worse, they soon realized that the Imperial army they were facing was much larger than they had thought. It didn't help that the German support they were expecting never materialized. One of the German commanders refused to commit troops, and the other died of disease in the middle of the campaign. By this point, Christian himself had advanced as far down into Lower Saxony as to Wolfenbüttel, where he established his campaign base. That's approximately 80 kilometers west of Magdeburg, where the Imperial Army had its headquarters. In late July, Christian set out to find and attack another Catholic army led by Count Tilly. Christian didn't know that Tilly had received reinforcements from Wallenstein, and that his army was therefore much stronger than Christian thought it was. A more immediate problem was that July 1626 was very wet, and heavy rains had turned the already pretty bad roads into little more than mud tracks. This meant that it took forever for the heavy baggage train with all the supplies to move, which in turn meant that Christian's army had to choose between moving quickly and eating. Since they chose eating, they never made it in time to assist the fortresses at Minden, Northeim and Göttingen, which Christian had hoped to defend. Now Tilly and his Catholic army took all of them, and at that point Christian decided he'd had enough. He ordered the Danish army to turn around and return to Wolfenbüttel, but the roads weren't any better going north than they had been going south, and progress remained slow. Eventually, Tilly's troops caught up with them, and the retreating Danish troops had to fight off cavalry attacks against their rearguard for 3 days, until Christian decided that he had to stand and fight, even though they were only 30 kilometers southwest of Wolfenbüttel, at a place called Luther am Barenberge. On August 27th, Christian ordered his army to prepare for battle. They formed 3 separate lines. Christian commanded the center personally, and the experienced commander Fuchs von Bimbach commanded the left line. The right, though, was commanded by Philip von Hessen-Kassel, who didn't have the same level of experience, not least because he was only 20 years old. Still, the Danish position was strong, with woods defending both flanks and a river in front of them. The Danish artillery also covered the only bridge. On paper, the Danes should be in a favorable position, even though they were slightly outnumbered. In reality, though, Christian soldiers were exhausted and starving. Not ideal conditions to fight a battle in. It didn't help that Christian didn't make clear to the other 2 commanders how orders would be conveyed and how much autonomy they could expect to exercise on the battlefield. The confusion in that regard only grew when Christian left the battle for a while to check on the baggage train, which was stuck in transit as usual. At noon, the fighting began. The Imperial artillery opened fire in an attempt to draw Danish attention away from advancing Imperial forces. It succeeded until his troops took the bridge and established a bridgehead on the Danish side of the river. Around 2 o'clock, they were ready to attack the Danish line. They moved against the left, and Fuchs ordered a counterattack, which actually succeeded in pushing the Imperial troops all the way back to the bridge. So far so good, but when Philip von Hesse-Kassel saw the fighting on Fuchs's side, he thought that meant that he was supposed to attack as well, which he did. Without waiting for orders of any kind, he just led a cavalry charge across the river and attacked Tilly's center. Meanwhile, Fuchs coordinated with Christian, and they decided that he should cross the river and attack Tilly's left, and Christian should try to wipe out the Imperial bridgehead on their side of the bridge. Even though there wasn't much water in the river, some of Fuchs's troops got bogged down in the soggy ground, and the formation became disorganized. Worse still, when they made it across, Tilly's cannons were directed at them, just waiting to mow them down. The artillery had orders not to fire before the attacking Danes were within 100 meters, but when they did, their salvo had a devastating effect. The Danes basically stumbled into a death zone, and those who survived turned and fled in utter confusion. Fuchs desperately tried to salvage the situation by leading a cavalry charge against Tilly's position, but he was shot and killed. So was his 20-year-old colleague Philip von Hesse-Kassel. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Tilly ordered his center to cross the river. At the same time, he sent his left wing around the woods to attack the Danes from behind. This double attack, in combination with their heavy losses up until that point, was the final straw for the Danes. Their formation collapsed, and only thanks to repeated heroic cavalry charges did any part of the army manage to escape the slaughter. Christian himself managed to make it back to the relative and temporary safety at Wolfenbüttel by the skin of his teeth, and after having no fewer than 4 horses shot from under him. His army had suffered 3,000 casualties, and another 2,500 had taken refuge in a nearby castle, but there their situation soon became untenable, and they surrendered to the Imperial troops already the following day. Tilly, meanwhile, had lost only 700 men. The Danes had also lost all their artillery and much of the baggage train, including 2 whole wagons filled with gold. Christian realized that he didn't have the resources or the manpower to go on fighting. In addition, he wasn't even safe in Wolfenbüttel and retreated north to winter in the vicinity of Hamburg. After his triumph at Luther am Barenberge, Tilly kept advancing. He swept north, taking Bremen and Verden that had been promised to Christian's younger sons. But he didn't move any further north that winter, because the Danes had devastated the countryside as they retreated northward, making it tricky for the Imperial army to pursue them. But it was only a temporary respite. When summer returned in 1627, both Tilly and Wallenstein continued northward. They occupied Christian's German duchies, Schleswig-Holstein, but they didn't stop there, and instead crossed the border into Denmark proper, ignoring that it wasn't the King of Denmark, but the Duke of Holstein who had declared war against the Emperor. Christian could do little to stop them, and soon imperial troops occupied all of the Jutland Peninsula. By the end of the year, the imperial armies had taken control over almost the whole German Baltic Sea coast as well, and Wallenstein was drawing up plans to have a mighty fleet constructed, with which he'd be able to compete with the Danes for control over the Baltic Sea. The situation for Christian was looking bleak, if not outright catastrophic. The war sure started to deserve its name, the Emperor's War, because it was definitely going Ferdinand's way. Christian was so desperate that he swallowed his pride and formed an alliance with Sweden in January 1628. It was hardly the outcome that Christian had expected when he entered the war, and hardly something he was particularly enthusiastic about, but he had no other choice. A third of Denmark was under foreign occupation, and at the moment he really didn't have much to throw at them if they would decide to take the rest. The Swedes, who weren't exactly Christian's greatest fans, agreed to the alliance because they too were worried about imperial expansion in the Baltic Sea. The Danish humiliation was just the icing on the cake. So Gustavus Adolphus promised to help by sending the Swedish fleet if need would arise. And that need soon arose. In September 1628, Wallenstein made the first move to implement the imperial plan to dominate the Baltic Sea. On May 13th, Stralsund in the Duchy of Pomerania was put under siege. This was the only port city on the Baltic Sea coast that still held out against the imperial forces. That made it a logical target for Wallenstein, but it also meant that it was absolutely vital to the Danes and the Swedes that Stralsund didn't fall. Gustavus Adolphus sent an army made up of Swedish and Scottish soldiers under the command of the Scot Alexander Leslie. When, in addition to the Swedes and Scots, a Danish force landed further east along the Pomeranian coast under the command of King Christian himself, the imperial troops decided to withdraw from Stralsund, at least for now, and go fight off the Danish invasion force. Initially, Christian and his army met little resistance, and they managed to drive off the imperial troops. On August 14th, 3 days after they landed in Pomerania, the Danes captured Volgast, about 70 kilometers southeast of Stralsund. The garrison holding Volgast was driven off fairly easily, and the inhabitants met Christian and his troops with enthusiasm. This was what Christian wanted, a Protestant population gratefully greeting him after liberating them from the yoke of the Catholic emperor. But he knew his victory wasn't secure yet. Wallenstein was on his way, marching east from Stralsund. He chose to meet the approaching imperial army west of Volgast, and there he waited with his army of somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 soldiers. Wallenstein, with a slightly larger force of some 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers, attacked on August 22nd. The battle was an unmitigated disaster for the Danes. Approximately 1,000 Danish soldiers were killed and another 600 were taken prisoner. Then, Wallenstein advanced toward the city of Volgast itself, which fell just as easily as it had done a few weeks earlier. The 500 Danish soldiers holding the city capitulated immediately. The imperial troops then proceeded to plunder and burn Volgast. King Christian himself only managed to escape under the cover of darkness. He and a fraction of the army that had come with him less than a month before snuck aboard their ships and sailed away to evade captivity. After the crushing blow at Volgast and the humiliating escape back to Denmark, Christian had to admit defeat. He turned to Wallenstein to open up peace negotiations. Wallenstein was in a favorable position. He had triumphed on the battlefield, and imperial troops occupied all of northern Germany, including Christian's German duchies and the Danish Jutland Peninsula. Nonetheless, the imperial commander was also keen to reach a quick end to the war. The new Danish-Swedish alliance threatened to shift the balance of power in the region, potentially threatening Catholic gains in northern Germany. So Wallenstein wanted to do what he could to keep the Swedes out of the conflict. In addition, the Holy Roman Empire was a big place, and the troops used in the Emperor's War were needed elsewhere. In northern Italy, for instance, where the War of the Mantuan Succession had just kicked off. That's why the terms of the peace agreed upon in Lübeck in May 1629 were relatively lenient. Denmark didn't have to give up any land, and Christian even got Schleswig-Holstein back. The only lands taken from him were Bremen and Verden. So Christian's younger sons would have to find other sources of income. But at the end of the day, it could have ended much worse for Christian and for Denmark. Much, much worse. They emerged from the Emperor's War largely intact. The one thing that wasn't intact, though, was Christian's prestige. He also had to promise to abandon his support for German Protestants and not to get involved in German affairs anymore, either as King of Denmark or as Duke of Holstein. That provision no doubt bruised his ego. Someone whose ego was only inflated by the war, though, was Emperor Ferdinand's. The successful conclusion of the Emperor's War gave him the impression that he had defeated the uppity Protestants and that he could now implement his agenda of re-Catholicization. In the spring of 1629, Ferdinand issued the so-called Edict of Restitution, which meant that all lands and property taken from the Catholic Church since 1555 should be returned. Even though this was technically legal, it wasn't the savviest political move ever. Implementing the edict would wreak havoc on every single principality in northern and central Germany. It also all but guaranteed that the Protestants of the empire would be stirred to renewed resistance, basically nullifying the success of the Emperor's War. The opening of the Pandora's box, in which the Edict of Restitution was delivered, also opened up for another ambitious Scandinavian king, one who hadn't just signed a deal not to interfere in German politics, to gain some glory in a war defending German Protestants. More on that next time. But before I sign off today, I'd like to share some feedback that I've received from a listener called Jan. He points out that back in episode 14, I said that the Vikings serving in the Varangian Guard in Miklagard, that is the bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors, had double-edged axes. They did not. They had long, single-edged but double-handed axes. Sorry about that slip-up, and thank you, Jan, for pointing out the mistake. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast, even if you think deciding arguments by throwing people out of windows is silly. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are also into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words or be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop, or if you just crave more content, at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you. Episode 85, The Emperor's War.